Ugh, it's getting cold and this fire's going down. Gonna need something to keep it going. Huh. Maybe this will help. What? Welcome back to my look at the Friday the 13th franchise. Today I'll be discussing the 1981 follow-up Friday the 13th Part 2, directed by Steve Miner. After the original was a huge financial success, grossing almost $40 million on a $500,000 budget, a sequel was inevitable. But when 99% of your original cast was killed, including a decapitated villain, what could be done? A possible anthology route was discussed, but ultimately they decided on the idea that Jason should be the killer. Sean Cunningham and Tom Savini weren't huge fans of that concept and decided to not return. More often than not, sequels fail to live up to their original counterpart, and it didn't necessarily look great for Friday the 13th Part 2. But did it manage to break this trend? Let's find out. The movie starts with a mystery person approaching the home of our previous survivor, Alice. She's having a nightmare that is conveniently recapping the end of the original film, from Mrs. Voorhees chasing her to Jason dragging her down into the lake. We have to relive all of this while also watching Alice awkwardly toss, turn, and moan during the entire process. It's really bad dream acting, and I'd be lying if it didn't make me slightly uncomfortable.
I'll have what she's having.
Alice briefly speaks to her mother on the phone and explains that living on her own is the only way she can put her life back together. Not really sure how that adds up, but she receives another phone call shortly after.
Hello, Sydney. Remember me?
Alice then goes to her fridge and finds the severed head of Pamela Voorhees, and her assailant attacks from behind with an ice pick to the temple. But he's kind enough to remove the kettle from the stove before we get the explosive opening title.
Michael Bay presents Explosions!
I have to admit, I'm not a fan of like 95% of this opening. I hate the recap nightmare that is really padding in this 86-minute film. Recaps are another running thing through the series, but this one has always been the most annoying one to me. Adrienne King's acting was mostly improvised on set too, which is clearly obvious. It's not her fault since they brought her in for like a day, but the rush is quite noticeable. Then we have Jason. He will always be my main man, but this introduction doesn't make sense if you start to think about it. How is he now a grown man? How did he find Alice? How did he make that phone call? Was he walking around with his mother's head the entire time as he tracked down Alice? The logic in all this is nowhere to be found, but I remember I'm watching a Friday the 13th movie and I can't think super hard. Just sit back and enjoy the ride. We flash to Jeff and Sandra, two teens calling for directions to Packanack Lodge. Crazy Ralph returns to warn them that they're doomed, just like the ones who didn't listen to him before. Naturally, they ignore him and eventually meet up with their prankster buddy, Ted. These three seem like a direct ripoff of Jack, Marcy, and Ned. I mean, really? Ned and Ted? You gotta try harder. Sandra finds out that they're going to be near the old Camp Crystal Lake, and she becomes enamored with checking it out, even though it's prohibited. At Packanack Lodge, we get to meet what I think we're to assume are teens, but look more like they're in their 20s. Paul is gathering up people for his counselor's training course. There's Terry with her assets, Scott the perv, Mark, the wheelchair-bound athlete, and Vicky, who totally wants Mark in the worst way. Our main protagonist, Ginny, shows up last, but doesn't seem too worried about it, unlike Paul, who wants her to take her job at the camp seriously. But he easily forgives her as it becomes apparent that they're together. And there's a cute moment where she tricks Paul into fixing her car, commenting that she enjoys using her child psychology on him more since it's so easy. I prefer this batch of kids way more than the first. Ted is the prankster, but I actually find him funny during his moments, unlike Ned. Vicky and Mark are cute, and you really root for them to get together. I'll admit, Terry is just flat out hot.
She had the fat ass, son.
And I enjoy the antics Scott gets into while hitting on her. Paul is a better group leader, being serious about his job, but manages to be cool and a bit of a smartass. Ginny is far and away a better protagonist than Alice. She's cute, smart, and has a fun personality. You find out more about her in her introduction than you did about Alice in an entire movie. The only characters I'm meh on are Jeff and Sandra. They have little to nothing going on other than Sandra's incessant badgering about going to Camp Crystal Crystal Lake. I'd say this cast is a huge improvement over the original. Night falls and Paul decides this is the perfect time to give it to everyone straight about Jason. His body was never recovered from the lake after he drowned, and legend has it he saw his mother beheaded that night. He still stalks the campgrounds as some deformed mountain man. They are the first to return in 5 years, and Jason's out there. I've always loved Paul's campfire tale about Jason. It has that natural feel of a scary story that's based on an old legend around the area. It kinda gives you an explanation to the viewer as to how and why Jason could be the killer. It's still very muddy, but I'm able to accept this myth as the backstory to Jason's return. Back at Ginny's cabin, her and Paul get a little cozy. Little do they know they're being spied on by Crazy Ralph. But they'll never find out after he's killed with barbed wire wrapped around his neck. The next morning, Ginny wakes up to a warning.
I read somewhere that their periods attract bears.
The teens go about their training throughout the day, but we get several POV shots of Jason watching them. Weirdly enough, I find these way more effective than when they were done in the original. It's almost as if the characters can feel the eyes watching them, but can't find where they are. That sense that you're being watched has always creeped me out, and I think the POV stock scenes are done well enough to prey upon that fear of mine. But Muffin the dog is able to find Jason, and we're left to believe the worst happens. I love that edit. Everyone hangs out by the lake during the day, and I can't stress again how much I prefer this group. They have great chemistry, and you get the sense that they could all actually be friends. I love when they're telling jokes to each other. The reactions feel authentic.
It's brown and sits on a piano.
Your face.
Beethoven's last movement.
While they're there, Sandra finally drags Jeff into the woods to go find Camp Blood. They stumble upon a torn up carcass that looks like it could be the remains of poor Muffin. You're also meant to think that they're being followed by Jason this whole time, but they get caught by Deputy Winslow. The deputy turns them into Paul, who isn't super bothered by their little field trip and gets snotty when it's recommended they be reprimanded.
I've got a better idea. Get the hell out!
After leaving, Winslow spots Jason out on the road. A chase ensues, and he's led to the dilapidated shack that he stupidly decides to investigate. His browsing leads to a hammer to the back of the head. Jason's shack is so freaky. It has a realistic look that you would think is actually built by some hermit in the woods. I remember there used to be this little building that was near where I live that reminded me of Jason's shack. It was for local farming, but I used to think Jason was gonna pop out and attack me for barging in. I was a bright kid. Night falls again, but Paul offers to take everyone into town for drinks. Everyone goes but Jeff and Sandra, who are ordered to stay behind by Paul. Terry wants to stay and look for muffins, so naturally Scott stays too. Mark doesn't go since he thinks a drunk in a wheelchair would spoil the fun, so Vicky decides to stay and cheer him up. The camp crew leaves the six behind, unaware that Jason is about to make his move. First up, Terry goes for a skinny dip, which could get me banned from YouTube. Scott continues to mess with her and steals her clothes, but he's caught in what he thinks is a trap set by Paul. I've always been under the impression it was done by Jason, showing off his mountain man skills. I don't think it's ever proven or disproven, but I just find it interesting that this backwoods hick could set up his own traps. Terry leaves to get something to cut Scott down, but before she can come back, he has his throat slit. With the wrong side of the machete. Terry comes back to cut him down, but finds him dead and screams herself to an off-screen death. And no, we never do find out how she was killed. Her body kinda pops up later, but high attention is never brought to it. It cuts from Terry to the bar that Ginny, Paul, and Ted are at. They have a deep discussion about Jason. More so Ginny, wondering if she can put the legend into real terms. He must have been devastated seeing the only one he ever loved killed. How would that affect him? Would he be a frightened man-child? An out-of-control psychopath? My bet is on the latter. But Paul and Ted assure her that Jason is a legend and nothing more. I like this whole scene because it shows Ginny's sympathetic side thanks to her child psychology teachings. She's been a bit of a smart aleck throughout the movie, but you can tell here that she really gives a shit about what she's talking about despite being blown off. It's a great setup for her character in a later scene. Back at the lodge, Jeff and Sandra head upstairs for some fun and leave Vicky and Mark alone. The flirting intensifies and it's clear the two are gonna hook up, but Vicky says the ill-fated words.
Be right back.
She goes to prepare herself with quite possibly the ugliest pair of panties ever created.
This guy's got the right idea. He wore the brown pants.
While she's away, Mark goes outside to wait for her, but gets a greeting from someone else. best kill. Seriously, this is my favorite kill in the entire franchise. It's brutal, mean, and darkly comedic with the tumble down the steps. And yeah, you actually feel bad. Mark is a totally nice guy who's about to get laid, but Jason blocks the hell out of him.
Blah, 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 blocked!
After that magnificent death, Jason heads upstairs to find Jeff and Sandra cuddling. He opts to kill 2 birds with 1 spear as he stabs through the both of them. This is a neat death of 2 characters you don't really care about, but it would have been nice to see the uncut version. All you get are the reactions and the spear at the bottom of the bed. Would have been nice to actually see them pull off a double spear, but unfortunately we'll never get an uncensored cut. Vicky is back from her prep, but can't find anyone. She gets the bright idea to go looking for the guy in a wheelchair upstairs. Oh, you were all thinking it. She thinks she'll find Jeff and Sandra under the covers, but we get our first full look at Sackhead Jason. No hockey mask yet, but I've always liked this look for him. It's still very creepy, but understandable that it didn't catch on in the following incarnations. Ginny and Paul come back from the bar to an empty lodge, but it doesn't take them long to find out that someone else is in there after Jason attacks Paul, knocks him out, and begins to hunt down Ginny. This is one of my favorite chase scenes in the franchise, filled with plenty of scares including a Jason window smash, a pitchfork through the door, an attack on Ginny's car, and even a kick to Jason's balls.
Mommy, daddy button.
However, there's a weird scene where Ginny is hiding under a bed and appears to wet herself after coming into contact with a rat, giving away her position to Jason. I've always thought that if I was being chased by some maniac in a potato sack mask, I'd have pissed myself a long time ago. Anyways, Ginny escapes to the forest and stumbles upon Jason's shack. This leads to one of my favorite shots in the entire franchise. Things seem semi-calm, and then you just see Jason in a sprint, and Ginny is none the wiser. I always start to yell for her to just freaking start running. I love it. Ginny locks herself, and what she finds out is Jason's shrine room to his mother, which is incredibly freaky imagery. Trapped, the best idea she can come up with is to put on Pamela's sweater and attempt to trick Jason into thinking she is his mother. And crazy enough, it works.
Jason, Mother is talking to you!
Jason, Mother is talking to you.
But eventually the jig is up and Jason fights back. Out of absolutely nowhere, Paul shows up to the rescue. While the two fight, Ginny uses the opportunity to take out Jason by burying a machete in his shoulder.
Is that the best you can do?
Yep. Apparently they thought that would be enough to kill him. They remove the mask, but it's never shown. Their reactions tell us everything there is as they hightail it out of there and get back to the lodge. But there's a noise. Is it Jason? No, it's just Muffin. She's returned in one piece. Phew, for a second there I thought Jason would... Jesus Christ! Oh, I mean, that totally didn't get me. In all seriousness, while a ripoff of the original's ending, I love this jump scare. I don't think it's as iconic, but it does get me every time. Between the glass smash and reveal of what Jason looked like underneath the sack head, it's pretty scary. A good attempt at recreating a classic jump scare. Flash to the next morning, Ginny is being wheeled out by paramedics yelling for Paul. We don't know where Paul is because we fade from Ginny being driven away to Pamela's head. And that's the end. Okay. The last 30 seconds of this movie should not be in here. It raises too many confusing questions. Was Ginny really attacked by Jason through the window? If so, how did she escape? Where's Paul? Was he killed by Jason? Did he save Ginny? Did he even ever show up to save her in the shack? I know the end shot was originally supposed to be with Mrs. Voorhees' head opening her eyes, insinuating that Paul was indeed killed, but the filmmakers thought that would be too ridiculous and cut it out. It should have ended with Jason breaking through the window and getting Ginny. You end on a great jump scare knowing that Jason is alive and our heroine meets an uncertain fate. But my overall thoughts on this movie, I love it. It's easily in my top 3 of the franchise, even with the complaints I have about the opening and ending. I mentioned it multiple times, but I love the characters way more. There's genuine chemistry and you're not actively rooting for them to be killed by Jason. They have more personality and likability. Ginny is also my favorite final girl in the franchise. She's cute, sassy, and smart. A huge upgrade from Alice. this. I also enjoyed Jason more as the killer. He was portrayed mostly by Steve Dash, although one Warrington Gillette disputed that for years, even though he was apparently only Jason during the unmasked scene. I am a fan of the one-eyed potato sack look, and I like how, as of now, Jason isn't this totally unstoppable force. He's just this deformed hillbilly that is pretty damn frightening. And I think this has one of, if not the creepiest atmospheres in the franchise. The POV shots of Jason watching the counselors is unnerving as he keeps getting closer and closer. There's a constant sense of you're being watched, and that scares me the most. I forgot to mention that Harry Manfredini returned to do the score, which also helped during those scenes. The final chase is also excellent. Ginny continuously fights back, using her head to beat her attacker. There are good jump moments throughout, leading to the ultimate climax in Jason's shack. So much to enjoy here. However, I think my complaints are apparent. I found the opening to be a time waster, recapping the first movie. How Jason found Alice is odd, especially when you have to know that he's been carrying his mother's head with him during this trip, and the ending becomes far more confusing than it needs to be thanks to that extra 30 seconds that could have been cut. And you'll notice, I didn't talk about the kills all that much. I'll be honest, they feel underwhelming after those iconic looking kills in the original. Not too much to see, since some of the kills here were either simple, cut for content, or off screen. But of course, the shining star is Mark's wheelchair of death. In a film with mediocre deaths, this one stands out the most, but also manages to be my favorite for all the right reasons. Despite my negatives, which oddly enough seem to stack up more than my problems with the original, I have far more fun with this one. I'm never bored after the opening, and everything seems to line up well with good characters, a great villain, and truly eerie atmosphere. This is a sequel that certainly outdoes the original. I give Friday the 13th Part 2 4 potato sacks out of 5. But let me know what you guys think. Does this entry outdo the original for you? How do you feel about the introduction of Jason? Is Ginny a top tier final girl? And how do you feel about that ending? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'll be back next week as we enter the third dimension with Friday the 13th Part 3 in 3D. Don't forget to subscribe and follow my Twitter, which you can check out in the link below. Until next time, peace.